So happy, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm Michael, event host at RJ Julia. We appreciate your support of the community, of our bookstore, and support of these two wonderful authors. We have Rachel Rueckert. I should have double checked that.
That's right, yeah, good job.
Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. And Katherine Howe.
Like, how are you? But
I have a pretty good idea for that one, yeah. Rachel and Katherine are in conversation tonight. As advertised, a major focus of this particular discussion will be pirates. But we also hope to hear more about the lives and work of our two authors tonight. After a brief introduction, we'll turn the stage to Katherine and Rachel. We'll have time for questions from the audience, maybe even a few activities. And you can raid the pirate chest if you didn't have a chance to already. Immediately after the event, both authors will be signing and personalizing copies of their books. Rachel Rueckert is an award-winning writer, editor, and teacher with degrees from Columbia University and Boston University. Her book, If the Tide Turns, is inspired by the captivating true story of real-life pirate Samuel Bellamy, combining high seas adventure, star-crossed longing, and an exciting tale of one strong-willed young woman determined to choose her own path. I also saw a comparison to like the Scarlet Letter, but in pirate times.
Yeah, vibes like Scarlet Letter.
Yeah. Katherine Howe is a best-selling and award-winning historian and novelist, spanning 3 centuries and 8,000 nautical miles, and compiled by a direct descendant of a sailor who waged war with pirates in the early 19th century. The Penguin Book of Pirates takes us behind the eye patches, the peg legs, and the skull and crossbones into the no man's land of piracy that is rife with paradoxes and plot twists. I should have mentioned that introduction was geared toward the book, not necessarily.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I also have degrees from BU in Columbia, but they're the opposite one. We're also we're both from the West, but like half connection up here. There's a lot going on. That's great. This is the first time we've been seen in the same room. Yeah, so now you know we're two.
Now we know you're definitely two.
Despite our hair being
Actually, you can purchase both of these books as well as Katherine's previous title at the register here tonight. Welcome, Rachel Rueckert and Katherine Howe.
Thanks so much. Thanks for me. So this is Rachel's debut novel. My job here is to ask her lots of tiresome questions, but I also want to make sure that we have time for questions from you all. So I think our master plan will be, I will pepper Rachel with many questions. And then eventually when it seems like there's a natural moment, I will take a breath and slurp some water, and you all will come up with any questions that you might want to ask her. Does that sound like I will keep my fangirling towards Katherine at a minimum, but it's real. So Rachel, this is your first novel that you have written. You've written a memoir before. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you make the change from nonfiction to fiction? And maybe once you've told us that, can you tell us how you learned about Black Sam Bellamy and his time on Cape Cod?
Sure. Yeah. So I always told myself as a writer, I've always been a writer, as most writers kind of are, kind of like, oh man, this is it. But I never believed that I was good at making things up. I thought like people who can make up things about dragons and all that. I just felt really far, but I was really like almost like driven to write about my own experiences and to process life in that way. And hopefully that matured a little bit, but my first book is a memoir in that way. But I think something about COVID hitting, something about that memoir going out into the world. I grew very, like, what's a fancy way of saying depressed? I was abundant.
Disenchanted.
Of this world at this time. I feel that. And I got invited to a writing group that was young adult fantasy authors. And I was like, oh man, this is not a fit. I was not a fit, but I was also not a fit really for probably life at that time. So I was just like, you know what, I'll join. And as I was sitting there, I remembered the spark of an idea, which plays into your second part of your question. Thank you for it. In 2015, I was on a journalism assignment in Provincetown. People been to Provincetown?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, with enthusiasm. I love it. Sometimes I do this in like Utah, and people are like, oh, like, oh, it's down pizza. And doing something totally different, but I got lured into this pirate museum. The pirate museum is now in Yarmouth, but what really struck me as I was in this pirate museum was what I learned, not just about pirates. I'd known a lot about pirates. I had like the pirate phase as a young girl. When I didn't know the answers to questions on tests, I would draw boats. I had like a plastic sword from Disneyland and dressed up as a pirate for Halloween every year until I was 18 for trick-or-treating, and nothing was going to take that from me. But it wasn't until I was in that museum and came across Sam's story that I was introduced to a very different spectrum. I mean, piracy was a spectrum. Like there were horrible, awful, the worst of the worst, and then Sam Bellamy seemed to be of a very different representation that I had not seen. His men called themselves Robin Hoods of the Sea, and everything that I learned just really challenged what I thought piracy was. And then, yeah, and there was a conversation I specifically had with a museum person on the way out. That is the reason why the novel begins with the word if, and it's like really fascinating possibility. And in that museum, like right then and there, I was like, someone needs to write this book. I should write this book. And then, that was 2015, and I didn't start drafting until 2021. So that's the spark of it. But I do think, like in retrospect, I think my nonfiction background, and also an anthropology background, I'm really interested in research. I'm really interested in kind of like the ethics and the challenge of like women's history, and I think so much of history is kind of a fiction. Memory, I know as a memoirist, is a kind of fiction, and so it's an interesting, it seems like a big pivot, and in some ways it is, and in some ways it didn't feel so different. So that's like kind of a meandering first answer.
Well, so here's a question, because this is something that I was thinking about while putting this primary source really together. How would you define piracy? Because I know oftentimes people have, there's sort of a slippery distinction between piracy and privateering. The word piracy is deployed in cases like the Barbary Coast, that I think actually it's kind of a misnomer, because I think it's more like ocean-going warlords in that kind of case. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your take is on how we define piracy, and why what you learned about Sam Bellamy is different from what you expected?
Yeah, so I think, as we know, piracy has existed since the dawn of time. People have been out stealing stuff, people have been out stealing stuff on the high seas. And it's interesting in like the context of like empire, which is up to some really shady stuff at the time, but it's like if someone had a letter of marque, like they were stamped with approval of like, hey, you can do all those terrible things, but it's legal, and in fact we'll like call you like a knight later in life. But really the actions were very similar. So yeah, I don't know how we like define piracy per se, but what was interesting about the golden age of this particular brand that Sam was dealing with like on this end was, and you talk about a lot in your works too, of just like the articles, this notion that pirates were living like proto-democracies 100 years before the Declaration of Independence was ever signed. I had never heard that until I went into the museum and continued to do this research. The things like lights are out at 8 o'clock, it's like we don't really think about that. And the musicians on board, there were musicians on board, get the Sabbath off, and if someone like cuts off your arm, you're going to get 600 pieces of silver, because it's like one of the first forms of workers' compensation. These were not things that I had heard of. And doing things by votes, splitting the treasure equally, or like according to someone's role, like that was just so radical for the time. And one of my favorite stories about Sam, and thinking about people who didn't have a chance to write their own histories, I'm so glad you've got like more primary source material and not like combined, because as is the case with like a lot of illiterate folks and a lot of women and marginalized people and BIPOC people, we don't have sources from them. This is again why I kind of think history itself is a kind of like fiction, or a very distorted one. But one story from Sam that really stood out to me that made it into this book is that there was a time when they recruited some more people. They were short 7 hammocks, and rather than saying, well, too bad, you 7 people have to sleep on the decks, instead Sam ordered that everyone would sleep on the decks, him included. And this was just really, really radical to me, and kind of that like show don't tell, like what someone's about at a time when the captain was like basically gone. It's like, if you're dead, like you're dead. It was just like that. So stories like that, things like that, just gave me a very different piece of, I think probably something that like we all want to believe. Like, oh, there were some good ones, right? But there was some evidence in a way that was really compelling to me. So that was interesting exploring that.
One of the things that people ask me a lot, and I'm interested to hear if you're getting this question too, and if you can talk a little bit about your approach, and that is it can be a bit tricky when writing historical fiction, having imaginary people interact with historical people, and how you balance that perspective or how you balance the demands of accuracy and so on and so forth. So can you talk a bit about that, about what your approach was and your time?
Yeah, and then maybe this is like a little bit neurotic, but there is like I've got a cast of characters in the beginning of the book that was my way of kind of at least naming like what I was up to for readers. So like if there is an asterisk, it indicates that like that is a real name from somebody. And if there are two asterisks, that is like someone who had a name, and also I knew some things about them with some history. And if there was an asterisk, like a reader could know like that is a native person. That was helpful for me to kind of just like at least try to be transparent about that. But yeah, it does feel weighty putting voices and personalities to people who really existed. And I think it's always like the weight of just like giving someone a voice, or someone who like the danger of like possible misrepresentation, but also like them not being voiced at all. It's just it's a really tricky tension. And I feel it a lot, especially with my nonfiction background, like writing about real people who are alive, who are my family members, you know, like I think there's a real responsibility there, and I don't quite know the answers, but it feels heavy in a way. So
What some of the sources that you consulted to get ready to write this book?
yeah, I was researching throughout as well. I, of course, like the general history of the pirates, which is turning 300 years old this month, like exactly 300 years old, which is just wild to me. The Widow Pirate Museum. I went to a lot of museums. I went to like every museum on Cape Cod multiple times, looking at like in some cases like oral histories that were really interesting. Like I do have in the back of this book here just various ones, but like especially in imagining Maria, we've talked a lot about like the pirate stuff, which is like what drew me in. But the woman that he loved, who was ousted as a witch, is also like her story is very interesting to me. And also, of course, that's the one that got morphed into like myth and lore because women's history. And so I had a lot more work to do to bring her out. But I had to consult a lot of like folk tales and like again a lot of like oral histories that have been transcribed. And I mean I was even like in the Salem Witch Museum looking at like which herbs did they use for what. You know, like I was really nerding out there.
So what can you tell us about the historical Maria?
Historical Maria, there was a book called Bellamy's Bride, that the woman who wrote this book kind of had a similar itch to me of just like I'm a little discontent to let Maria be a footnote in Sam Bellamy's epic history. Even Sam, I wish he had more of a footnote. Like when I ask people like who was the richest pirate during the Golden Age, no one knows it's Sam Bellamy. So people say Blackbeard, Captain Bear, like I don't know. Yeah, but Sam's inked in history. The Widow, the ship, inked in history. But the third piece of it, which I believe, and talking to like the wealthy historical museum people, like there's just enough stories and stuff about Maria that's like really, really believing she was real, but like that the why behind the story just missing. And so yeah, the author of Bellamy's Bride was discontent for Maria to be a footnote in this epic, and I felt the same. And so she does a really great job in doing some research to figure out like genealogically who could this woman have been. And I pulled one of the sources that I found most compelling of a woman who appeared to have been scrubbed from the record, which matched up with some other like plot things that were like a little bit spoilery, so I won't share them. But yeah, her name was Mehitable Brown.
That's a great name.
Yeah,
I love the name Mehitable.
yeah. I try not to be like me hit a bowl. It's just like ooh, maybe that name. But yeah, Mehitable is prettier. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Maria. Yeah, they called her Maria or Goody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to read some of the books for us? I guess maybe to give us a taste.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll read first the prologue, if that's okay. And I think again, bringing us back to that generous question you asked, which is kind of like, where did this come from? Just like from a whole memoir background to this. The very first thing I wrote for this book, and I'm sure Katherine, you understand this as a writer, writing is basically rewriting. But the very, very first thing I wrote for this book was this prologue, and it never changed. And so it's eerie to me that like this is what it was, and it never changed, and it is the voice of Maria. I guess like as much as I love the pirate stuff, it's Maria's voice. So I'm gonna read that to start, and we'll see where we're at. That's okay. I know this place, how the spindly grass bends against the rolling dunes, the bite of salt air, the brine of pink Atlantic mornings along the docks. I know the hideouts for lovers, the townsfolk, and the church with its hard pews and shadows, a barn with a boot print, a whipping post, a cell real and imagined. I know every spine of this shore and the woman whose voice cries and curses whenever storms hammer the bone white sand where lie the remains of the widow and her treasure, her crew. I know something of ghosts, including some who had the audacity to survive. And so then I was like, oh, okay. Like, witchy lady, what do you have to say? And that's where we started. So, yeah.
Another question that I sometimes confront, that I'm sure you had to as well, is in thinking about writing a story that's set in a pretty remote period of time. How did you work on creating an authentic voice for your characters? And how did you, like, one thing I think about a lot is the difference between verisimilitude and accuracy. Because
Absolutely.
sometimes what is accurate is not necessarily what seems accurate. And in a historical fiction context, you know, our responsibility is to create the illusion and not do anything that's going to pop the
Yeah.
bubble or burst the
Yeah.
illusion, even because we can't just stand over your shoulder and say, no, really, that's how it was.
Yeah.
And so how can you talk a bit about your approach as far as language goes with the book?
Yeah, especially, yeah, you know, and you know, this is like crucible times. And so it's like a lot of like, you know, speaking like the Puritans, and I chose not to do that. That just felt too.
Don't worry, Arthur Miller didn't either.
Yeah, that's true.
That was a sick burn.
I like my sick burn. All right, good job for those who got that. Great. But I think where I found it like also tricky was in like pirate language because Hollywood and so many like Hollywood very much kind of invented a lot of like the pirate accent that we think of. And so there were just things like in the history, and because Sam is so well documented, like whether it's from like people who we captured their ships from, or you know, whether or not the dubious takes of Johnson's speeches attributed to Sam. But you know, like there's one point, like there's two examples I'm thinking of. One is Sam briefly teams up with a really horrible privateer named Henry Jennings. He was nasty. And there's a point where they're like talking and like they get into this like really big chant. They're challenging Henry Jennings, and they were keeping like one for all. And it's like, you can't say one for all. Like the Musketeers took that, but apparently like that's you know, a thing. But this is where it came out the most. There is a speech that Sam is credited with in the general history of the pirates. Again, that like pirate Bible that's turning like 300 years ago. That is a curious text, and also we don't know who wrote it, which makes it extra.
I was gonna ask your theory, if you had a theory.
Oh, that's part of my next book, actually. I've like created a frame anyway.
Okay.
I'd love to hear your theory is what I want to hear. But there's one like really epic speech. Sam was apparently like very just very he liked to talk. He was very persuasive. And this is one of his epic speeches, and he's talking with a guy named Captain Beer. One of the things I love about the historian stuff, like I did not make up this guy's name is Captain Beer. There's a guy named Ben Morninggold. It's just like, oh man, some things you just can't make up. So Sam is arguing with a guy named Captain Beer, and Captain Beer is upset because Sam's crew, who does everything by votes, has voted to sink Captain Beer's ship and to put Captain Beer and his men on a little island until they're rescued like 2 hours later. And Beer like is looking to Sam, just like reverse this. You're the captain, like, right? You're the god of the ship. Like, what do you like? Why would I answer to your like mongrel men? And Sam is like trying to like have like a almost like a philosophical debate with him at this point. And so This comes back to the thing of language though, because if you look at what I write here, and we'll read shortly with what Captain Johnson wrote exactly, it starts to sound silly. But first let me read like my kind of version where I did have to modernize some things. My writing group was like, why is he talking so weird? And like that, but again, it burst the bubble. And so it's like, how do you get the essence? So here's the speech from Sam, but like according to Johnson, this is what he said. Sam and Captain Beer. Damn you, Sam said, bellowed through gritted teeth. You and all those who submit to corrupt laws made to protect rich men's security. They vilify us, scoundrels like you. But there is only one difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Wouldn't it be better to join us rather than sneak after the asses of villains for employment? At which, Beer said something about, like, you have no morals, blah, blah, blah. And Sam says, there's no arguing with men like you. But think twice before you disparage me or my brothers in the name of what you call a conscience. I am a free prince. My men and I have as much authority to make war on the whole of this broken world, with more right than 100 set of sails or an army of 100,000 men. And this, my conscience tells me. And I feel just like a lot of like heat coming from Sam in this, and that was really important. And when I had a lot of the like, you sniveling dog, you puppies, and this is like it became comical in a way that like he's still like, I've got the like damn you and like you are, but too many of those, it really starts to like people start to play Hollywood in their brain. And so I think that was my biggest challenge there. It's just but tried to use language when I could, or phrases of the time, but whether like not just being like there was a boat, it's like no, this was a sloop, and like trying to get at least the nouns precise, even if the dialogue couldn't be.
There are a lot of very specific nautical terms.
Oh my
The
gosh,
number
the
of
whole world.
footnotes in this book, just defining nautical terms, not trivial.
Not wait. And also the internet loves it. My favorite thing to do with my followers on Instagram is like, what do you think this word means? And people just like play balderdash, and it's just
That's a fun
man.
game. That should-
Enjoyment. Let's it's a whole world. It's a whole world.
Well, maybe this is an opportunity. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Maybe this is an opportunity to see if anyone who's listening wants to jump in and ask us something.
Question. Yeah. What's the difference between a pirate and a privateer?
Do you want to?
It's all about legitimacy and point of view. So they do the same things. The difference is that a privateer does it under authority. So they are given a letter of marque, which is basically like a license from a government to raid enemy shipping. Now, the tricky thing with that is that means from the perspective of Spain, someone might be a pirate to Spain's point of view, but might be a national hero from England's point of view. There's another tricky, slippery part of it, and that has to do with the authenticity or legitimacy of letters of marque. Because in one sense, countries could, this is one thing that happened with William Kidd, if I'm not mistaken. He was a privateer, and yet the political world changed around him while he was on his voyage, and then he became a pirate, like on a technicality. And my other favorite story of the slippery distinction between privateers and pirates is actually Jean Lafitte, because Jean Lafitte was a famous pirate in the early part of the 19th century on the Gulf Coast, and he raided under letters of marque. So he was based on an island in Texas, and he raided under letters of marque alternately from Cartagena and from Mexico. Mexico was not free from Spain yet. They were in the process of struggling for their independence from Spain, and so was Cartagena. But so Lafitte had letters of marque that authorized him, heavy quotes, to raid Spanish shipping. But they were not legitimate in the eyes of Spain, or really anyone else, because he had largely just made them up. And in fact, he established a court of admiralty on Galveston Island, which was like him and his friends. Because when you came to shore with a prize seized under a privateering license or letter of marque, you had to officially condemn it in a court of admiralty. So that'd be like us going out, capturing somebody, and then the five of us get together and declare it a court of admiralty, and we condemn and then we split the treasure. So it was all just like largely like a slip of the tongue.
Also eye patches, right?
Well, the best thing about eye patches and like the two kind of biggest literary pirates that we all kind of know are Captain Hook, right? And Long John Silver. Captain Hook is missing a hand. Long John Silver is missing a leg. Like the physical mutilation of literary pirates is both has like an antecedent. You alluded to this in the article. It's like this is dangerous work. Yeah, it was very easy to lose a limb while sailing. In fact, Rupert Murdoch lost a finger yachting. Not quite the same, but he did lose a finger and it had to be reattached. And so, yeah, he was doing the Sydney Hobart race and got sliced off. It's very dangerous sailing work. But I think in literary representations of pirates, the mutilation of their bodies is clearly supposed to stand in for the mutilation of their souls. It is meant to be like some kind of ableist stereotype about evil and contortions of the soul.
You're killing me because I have crates and crates of research that I did on women pirates.
Yes.
And similarly, I was inspired by the Pirate Museum in Nassau in the Bahamas, where I'd been there forever.
Yeah.
Just went in one day and got started. But I'm not kidding, I had all this stuff and it got completely ruined. It got waterlogged and I never found any of it. But I'm dying to see your book. Do you have anything in there on the female pirate? I know you have Sarah Bonney, but
Well, so I have
Mary on the cover.
but I mean, they were Amazonians.
Yes, we have in this book. I talked about Anne Bonny and Mary Read,
Yeah.
the very famous ones.
The two.
Her next book is going to be an Anne Bonny story.
Yeah,
My
good.
just previous novel is called A True Account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself. And it is a woman disguised as a man pirate story. It's my engaging with that trope. This book also talks about Grace O'Malley, although Grace O'Malley, again, like I think pirate is sort of a tricky word to apply to her. She's more like an ocean-going warlord. She's more like a warlord, but she's called a pirate queen. This book also talks about John Sal in the South China Sea in the early 19th century, and Fanny Campbell, who is fictional, but she was so widely disseminated. In fact, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem has a piece of scrimshaw with Fanny Campbell on it, and the label says Fanny Campbell, female pirate captain. It doesn't say that she's from a novel. She's fictional. Yeah, she was so widely she's represented on scrimshaw all over the place.
Wow.
But one thing I endeavored to do in this volume was look at the mythologizing of piracy and its relationship to fiction, because of course I'm a historical fiction person coming at it from a history background. And pirates were romanticized and mythologized even in their lifetimes often. And one thing that's fun in this book is there are a couple of sources that when you juxtapose them next to each other, you can kind of tell which one is true and which one is presented as if it is true, but clearly isn't. I had a lot of fun.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and then a question. First, the comment. I'm so glad you read the prologue again, because I read the book and I started with the prologue and I said, oh, what is this? And I was a little lost. And then after knowing who Mary is and rereading it and hearing it, it totally brings light into what it is.
All the Easter eggs, right there.
That was fantastic. And then have you been to Stony Creek, and is there really a pirate there, or was a pirate there?
I'm not sure. Stony Creek, where are you? I don't know about Stony Creek.
You guys, nobody.
I know the brewery.
I do know about this book talks about Dungeon Rock and Lynn, which is one of those things that is a very long-standing story that started to circulate in the 19th century, and which is certainly buckets or bunk rather. But I don't know if I know the Stony Creek story.
Well, there are lots of little islands in Stony Creek, and I think
Where is Stony Creek?
Not far.
Brantford.
Is it here?
Yeah,
Down the shore
Okay.
in Brantford.
Okay.
I forget which pilot or pirate they mentioned was around Stony Creek and doing navigation around that
Well,
area.
Newport was a notorious pirate nest. And in fact, Newport had one of the biggest hangings of pirates to take place all in one day. Like I think in 1623, they hanged something like 21 pirates all at the same time. And they buried a number of them on this sort of like gravelly, I think it's actually called Gravelly Pit. And reportedly, they buried them at half tide, which means that in theory, I know, because then they'll never rest because the tide is always coming back for them. I think it's probably just a happy accident. They cut them down and it was half tide. And they're like, let's get rid of them right now. But I know it's grim. But there was certainly no shortage of pirate activity along this coast. Newport was a notorious pirate nest. Boston had a lot of pirate activity. New York had pirate activity. The Carolinas had tons of pirate activity.
So could you, for people who haven't read the book, could you, it goes to what you just said, but I'll direct it to you, your book, does it take place on the Cape? And what time period?
Yeah, so my book takes place between 1515 and 1517, and it's split between Maria's perspective, who's 17. I have dyslexia. 1715 to 1717. How many times I made that mistake and someone didn't correct me?
Wow,
That's a long time ago. We're not talking about that time. In what is Eastham today and Wellfleet, which was called Billingsgate at the time. So half the story takes place there. It's a very important rooted place for the story. And then the other part is Sam going through the Caribbean.
Oh,
So,
in the Caribbean.
Yeah. So like they fall in love with this like Romeo and Juliet type story. And then they spent most of the book apart where Sam is trying to get rich enough to come home and marry her in a way that she's rich and he's the poor orphan. You know how that story goes. So hopefully this one is a little fresh, but like, so yeah, the Caribbean is an important point, but Eastham specifically and Wellfleet, which was Billingsgate at the time, are very dear to my heart. I've been there very many times in the off season, just being on the beach where it all happened. So,
And you,
yeah.
you mentioned in the back of your book, of the book, you have sources, and I think you mentioned the Wellfleet Museum.
The Wellfleet Historical Society. Yeah. So and in my acknowledgements too, there's a lot of people I have to name. I also am really indebted to the historian Linda Coombs, who is a Wampanoag historian and Indigenous community member who helped me a lot with one of the characters of Bias Sampson, who's based on a real life character in this. And so I'm very indebted to the local Cape Cod community for their sources and what they have shared with me. And in some ways, this really is like, this is their pirate. This is a really, in some ways, Maria is their most famous ghost story. And so it's really near and dear to them. But yeah.
And the Wida is the name of the ship?
The Widow, yeah.
Oh,
It's the
Wida,
name of the
okay.
ship, yeah. So Sam had multiple ships throughout, but and what happens with the ship, and it's a complicated ship. But yeah, a lot of, yeah.
So can I just jump in and help for 1 second? So the Widow is actually famous because it is one of the most complete pirate shipwrecks that has been found and actually like proven to be real.
And where was it found?
Wellfleet.
Oh, up on the
Yeah,
Cape.
so the story that she's talking about is based on a real thing that happened. And there was a pirate who spent time on Cape Cod, famously fell in love, had a sort of love affair, then went off, did his pirate thing. The Widow was a galleon for transporting enslaved people. And so Sam Bellamy grabbed it when it was passing through the Bahamas. And then he was shipwrecked back where he'd fallen in love. This all really happened. This is all true. And the shipwreck of the Widow, or the Widow, was discovered a few years ago by a guy named Barry Clifford, who's written books about it. And there are artifacts of it at a museum in Salem, and also
Wait,
in the historical
in
society.
Salem, but not in.
It's mostly in
Wellfleet.
Yarmouth.
It's
There's
mostly in
things
Yarmouth,
all over
but there's some-
Massachusetts.
What
Scattered
museum in
around.
Salem?
There's one called Real Pirates of Salem Museum. I think it's a strong word. I'm doing an event there on Saturday. I'll let you know.
Yeah, it's worth
Is
going
that
to Yarmouth.
new?
It's kind of new. It's across the street from the one with all the wax guys in it.
The what? What?
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
In Salem, though, you're talking about.
Go to the one in Yarmouth. Go to the one in
Go to
Yarmouth.
the one
That's
in
where you'll yeah,
Hey, wait a second, in Yarmouth?
Yarmouth on the
I'm
Cape.
on the
Cod.
Cape, so what's there? Wait a minute, because I'll be on the Cape in 2
Okay,
weeks,
good.
so I'm
Go to
very.
Yarmouth,
All
go to
kinds of
the
stuff.
Widow Pirate
The witch pirate in
Whydah.
Whydah Pirate.
It's spelled WHYDAH
in London.
in Yarmouth.
Make sure you read this book too, because
Yeah,
we
yeah,
just covered some major spoilers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I've got a question
Yeah.
also. Curious for both of you, if there were any particular scenes or locations or maybe minor characters that we might not necessarily notice, but that have like a special significance to you.
I'm curious to like hear your answer to that. Why, like, even as you're like thinking, I'm so glad that Mary Read is on the cover. I'm so sick, like to your comment about female pirates and
But
romanticizing.
it's the one with her showing her
Of
breasts.
course it is. But like,
Yeah.
I feel like every
I do that in Yacht Races. It's a flawless strategy. Everyone
Was
gets
that the,
panics.
that was the character that you related to? No, okay, sorry.
it's but just like there's always like one female protagonist and she's redheaded and she's flaming hot and she's like super bloodthirsty, never pregnant, never like any of the things that actually happen anyway. And I feel like Mary always gets written out. So anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
So in the novel that I had come out a couple of months ago, it came out in November. That is also, it's a pirate story. It's set in Boston. It starts in Boston. And that one starts at a real hanging that really took place in Boston. In 1726, when they started to shut down piracy on the East Coast because it was proving too much of a threat to international shipping and trade. Like governments were like, we've got to shut this down.
And when you say they, then it's the British
Yes.
who shut it down, not the
Yes.
Americans.
Well,
No,
we
we
weren't American
at that
We
point.
weren't American yet,
Yeah.
but it was colonial powers were also seeking to shut it down. The reason that we know what was said on the gallows when this pirate named William Fly was hanged was because the guy who oversaw his execution was Cotton Mather.
Cotton Mather's also in this book.
You recognize his name,
Yeah.
it's because he oversaw the Salem witch trials too. He wrote a book about it, and he wrote a book about this pirate trial that he did. So, so I have thought a lot about William Fly. I spent a lot of time thinking about William Fly. Happy if you hit my William Fly button, we're gonna be
It's a
So
really
we
great
cover
novel. The one over like yeah.
But why don't you talk about some of your favorite minor characters and if it's
Yeah, I talked briefly about Abaya. Abaya is based on a woman named Delilah Sampson Gibbs, who is an indigenous woman on Cape Cod who we have from an oral history, healed a white woman of breast cancer, and her story all but got released. But the local museum just did a really cool exhibit on her, and so I'm really interested in like of all the stories I've heard about Sam and Maria. Again, this is a very, very, very famous Cape Cod story. I've never heard what's going on with the indigenous people at the time, and I was really interested to learn that at these exact same years, not 1515, 1715 to 1717 is the height of some land disputes, where there was actually a lot of political action on part of the Wampanoag people, and so I felt it was really important to represent that in a way. So I feel very grateful to Linda Coombs, and she actually named Abaya because, and that's a Christian name, because at this point imposed Christianity and it, English dressing and all that would have been the way to get through for them. So yeah, I'm into her. I'm into Maria's sister Elizabeth. I feel like is kind of a shadow character to me in a way, and I'm into her. Does anyone not love their main character? Like and side character? Like I don't know.
I think
Yeah.
sometimes often we hear like authors spend so much time with their characters that it's like they know them. or
Yeah,
like
no,
yeah.
that's really. In fact, one question I do get that's asked a lot of just like, who would you cast in the movie? And I'm just like, I always just draw things. I'm just like, I see them in my brain. I don't see actors. It's really hard for me to like think of an actor.
Do you always like your characters though? Because like people tend to sometimes
yeah.
assume that we like our characters all the time. One of my main characters in A True Account is kind of a pill. She's like sort of irritating. What are we talking? Marion. Marion's a pill. But like she's nice.
She's not married, yeah, but she's a
like,
difficult woman.
She's not easy. You don't necessarily want to hang out with
You don't
her.
want to give her a hug, or maybe you do want to give her a hug. It's
She
complicated.
needs a hug.
She needs a hug. She needs a hug. Yeah, that's well said.
Is there a hand over there? I thought I saw someone raise a hand.
I have another question.
Yeah, go for it.
So this, the pirate book that seems like both of you used as a reference, the one that's turning
Mhm.
300.
A general history of the pirates.
Yeah.
So you said that there's theories about who wrote it.
So A General History of the Pirates, which was first published in 1724 and went through 9 editions. And then, yeah, it was like a colossal bestseller. It's massive. It's 800 pages long. It is written by someone named Captain Charles Johnson. There is no record of a real person named Captain Charles Johnson. Some historians for some years thought that that was a nom de plume for Daniel Defoe. There are other literary historians who have put aside that theory. The copyright, if there wasn't really copyright, but there is a suggestion of a guy who's behind it, who is sort of responsible for the printing of it. My theory is that he is kind of like the editor in the way that I'm the editor of this, that he like gathered these sorts of oral stories together from people and collated them and sort of put them all together. So it is, historians of piracy are very sniffy about referring to a general history as a primary source because it is romanticized. It's written in a way to be exciting and fun and great to read. That being said, that doesn't mean that it's not true necessarily. It's hard to substantiate. But it is a primary source that was in circulation in 1724, which is when a lot of these people were still alive and were still around.
So follow up to that.
Yeah.
Did it need to be translated to modern English at some point? Or like, was it readable as we could read it, something like today?
I find it very readable. In
Okay.
fact, I've excerpted many of the things in here are excerpted from there.
Oh, awesome.
It's dense, it's long.
Mm.
And it went through a couple of different editions with some illustrations and things like that. It would be a tough casual read
Yeah.
to pick up. Because I actually, with Penguin Classics, I did propose, wouldn't it be fun for there to be a Penguin Classics edition of it? And I could do an intro for that. And they're like, no, you're out of your mind. No one's going to read that book. It's long. I know.
It was published in England.
It was also published here. It was published all over the place. And very widely and in over and over and over again. And it is still available. There's a facsimile edition you can get from Dover Maritime. So it's, you can get it now.
I have another question.
Mhm.
So what, the height of the piracy period in British America and the Caribbean is when?
Early 1600s to about 1730.
Early 1600s.
Early 1600s to about 1730. Mhm.
There wasn't much going on here in the early 1600s.
There was a lot going on in the Caribbean in the early
Yes.
1600s, and there was a lot going on in the Mediterranean in the early
Yes.
1600s.
But because your novel is based on the Cape, and
Yeah.
there is the American,
Right.
British American slant.
Mhm.
I have another question, but you wanted to do something.
Please ask your question here.
So are you the descendant of a?
If a person, see, I need to get a little bit deeper in my research. I am the direct descendant of William Bradford, which, if anyone knows, the
Yeah.
Mayflower people, and also direct descendant of Pocahontas, but we're not gonna be tweeting about that. So, yeah.
Did you have another question?
Well, I'd just like to bring it up to today, because I mean, it's still going on.
It is. It is.
Eritrea, I think, and so my question, do you keep up with any of that news or things? Because I have been keeping up with that, and it's quite, again, from a feminist point of view,
Yeah.
it's really horrible, the amount of trafficking,
Yeah.
sex trafficking
Yeah.
of women
Yeah.
that are being forced to become involved in pirating. So I
Yeah.
wonder if I mean, I know you're a historian, but
Right.
it's still happening.
It is definitely still happening. And also the migrants who pay coyotes to smuggle them. Like one of the things that was striking to me when researching this book was I sort of knew it in the abstract way, but really understanding the extent to which Golden Age piracy was absolutely bound up with the transatlantic slave and
Yeah.
trade in enslaved people.
Mhm.
And modern day piracy is bound up in drugs and raiding international shipping and trafficking of humans in the same, not the same way, but in a similar
Yeah.
way.
I mean, think of how swashbuckling and Pirates of Penzance and all this. We have pirates. You say the name pirates to people, and
Sure.
we get excited, but
course.
ooh, it's
Well,
right out there. as
That
a
is
scary
an
thing.
argument that I make in this book, actually, that one of the reasons we're romantic about pirates in the Golden Age is because we don't know anything about them. And also that a theory that I have is that romanticizing pirates and maritime life in that period is a way of overwriting and not having to think about
Oh,
the
reading
trade in
history.
enslaved people.
That's fascinating. Okay.
Because in actual truth, you cannot talk about them separate
Yeah.
from each other.
That's good.
So like We could talk for a while
Yeah.
longer. We have an opportunity though, if you'd like to, so we have copies of If the Tide Turns, we've got the Penguin Book of Pirates, we've also got the other book by Catherine that we alluded to at Truist
I
County.
just read it this week. It is fantastic. It is
Wait,
so
the
good.
account is.
It's called A True Account.
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of these are available for purchase at the register here, and then our authors will be signing.
What about your
What was that?
memoir? Is it you?
My memoir's not here, but if you sign up for my newsletter, next March is when my other historical novel will come out, and my newsletter has stuff about my memoir too. Yeah.
So we're just gonna say before we close, we both alluded to works in progress, but tell us both what's coming or what you're working on.
Oh, man. Yeah, so to what we were talking about before in kind of challenging the like, here's the hot flaming redhead. Yeah, so it's a very much imagined, but also doing the work with sources that I could find, which are few and far between, and a lot of mythologizing, if you will, of Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who are I mean, this comes up in your book too, but a lot of women actually, we don't know how many, but a lot of women did cross-dress and become cabin boys and enter the Navy and like all these things. We just don't have their stories. And these were two women where we do have at least something of their story. And so it's called The Determined, and it's about the impossible choices and circumstances that women in their circumstances made and what got them pregnant and put in jail in Jamaica. So, yeah.
Great, Catherine, anything you're working on?
I'm chopping carrots for my next novel. I'm in the, like, you know, when you make stew and you have to chop all the vegetables first and it takes forever. I'm in the carrot chopping stage for my next novel right now. But before that, I'm gonna finish my PhD, which I never did. I'm finishing that this summer. So
Excellent.
I'm good.
Do you already have a topic?
It's gonna be a thing about historical fiction. It's gonna be kind of, yeah.
Thank you both. Everybody, please help me thank.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and joining me. That's a good name. It's such a treat.
We'll move the chairs around a little bit. We'll set this table up and so we'll have you sign right here.
Oh, one last thing. If I have an author's copy that I have people sign, if you would be willing to sign my copy, I would be so okay. I'll put that over here with the loot. We still